People have a lot to say about the Talmud.
False and inflammatory claims about the Talmud.
That's what the Talmud says. What these people say.
They're treating them like subhuman beasts, and it sells that in their Talmud.
But what is it really? Because between the covers of the Talmud's 76 volumes is a literary labyrinth so complex, so convoluted, and so tricky that it takes years to read the whole thing. Sure, Jews treat it as holy scripture, but it's been banned, burned, put on trial. So if the Talmud is so controversial, why do Jews still spend thousands of hours poring over its pages? The year is 200 CE. The mighty Roman chariots rule the vast shores of the Mediterranean. A tiny Jewish community, led by Rabbi Yehudah HaNasi, is still holding on by a thread in the land of Israel. Now, Rabbi Yehudah HaNasi has a choice: write down the Torah's never-before-compiled oral tradition, or face the extinction of Jewish scholarship and change Judaism forever. He chose the former. The oral tradition dated back to when the Jews first received the Torah. It was the unwritten ins and outs of exactly how the 613 commandments in the Torah should be kept. For centuries, it remained exactly that, unwritten. Transcribing the oral law was forbidden. But now, the oral law teetered on the brink of erasure. The Jewish people were deeply fractured. The Romans had forced most Jews into exile and enslaved thousands of others. The small pocket of Jews remaining in the land of Israel tried to cling to their religious practices through cycles of Roman oppression. The unbroken transmission of the oral tradition was cracking. Enter Rabbi Yehudah HaNasi. He was on excellent terms with the emperor of his day, but he knew the Jews were on borrowed time. In an emergency, Judaism says some rules can be suspended, and this was a 5-alarm spiritual fire. So he picked up his quill and started to write. 130 years after the stones of the Holy Temple had been burned to ash, he published a brand new work called the Mishnah, the first ever written edition of the Torah's oral tradition, a set of 6 volumes, each dealing with an overarching theme of Jewish law. This would become the foundational layer of the Talmud. Copies of the Mishnah made their way to the Babylonian Empire, where many exiled Jews had reestablished houses of learning. The Mishnah laid out Jewish law in a brief and digestible style, but it left out a lot of details. In the 300 years that followed its publication, scores of rabbis in both the land of Israel and Babylonia debated every single point of the Mishnah. Here's an example. The Mishnah says the owner of an ox is responsible for any damage it causes. Okay, simple enough. But then the rabbis asked, what do you mean by damage? Are you as responsible if your ox gores someone as you are if it eats their produce? What if your ox kicks or bites or tramples your neighbor's field? Hey, what if their field is only partially destroyed, not completely destroyed? And on and on and on. Question after question after question. With most Jews now living in exile, it was widely accepted that the oral law could be written down. So in study halls from Babylonia to the land of Israel, Jews began taking notes. These were eventually compiled and redacted into the Gemara, an extended analysis and expansion of the Mishnah. Together, the Mishnah and the Gemara form the Talmud. Okay, technically 2 Talmuds, one compiled in the land of Israel, known as the Jerusalem Talmud, and one in Babylonia, known as the Babylonian Talmud. A combined 76 total volumes and nearly 7,000 printed pages, covering everything from criminal justice to theology to tort law to the correct way to put on your shoes. In the Talmud, time is a flat circle. Rabbis who lived generations, even centuries apart, appear to argue, respond, and question one another, as if seated around the same table. Now, the 2 Talmuds are similar, but where the Jerusalem Talmud gets to the point and delivers a ruling, the Babylonian Talmud meanders. Also, in addition to the intellectual back and forth on Jewish law, both Talmuds are sprinkled with what's known as Agadah, legends, stories, anecdotes, morality tales. For centuries, the Talmud was preserved as fragile handwritten manuscripts, painstakingly copied by scribes, passed from community to community, pored over by scholars. But decades of wear and tear weren't the only threats to the integrity of the manuscripts. Christians singled out the Talmud as the reason Jews rejected conversion and clung so insistently to Judaism. The Talmud, not the Bible. Because while Christians considered the Bible a stepping stone to the revelations of Christianity, the Talmud was wholly and emphatically only for Jews. More than the Bible, the Talmud was the guide to Jewish life, a physical symbol of how Jews defied the events of history to survive. The Talmud's very existence was a thorn in the side of those who were determined to quash the Jewish faith. Moreover, the Talmud was slandered as deeply insulting to Christianity and put on trial, and conviction on the charge of heresy was a foregone conclusion. Christian authorities in medieval Europe made a bonfire out of the Talmud. Years of work would go up in smoke, an echo of the Roman repression that made writing down the oral law so essential in the first place. But ironically, it was two Christians who changed the course of Talmudic history for the better. Johann Gutenberg, the inventor of the printing press, and Daniel Bomberg, a 16th century printer in Venice with a passion for Hebrew texts. Bomberg wasn't the first to create a printed Talmud, and he borrowed the layout from the edition published by the Soncinos, a family of Italian Jewish printers. But Bomberg was the first to print every volume of the Talmud, and his new page numbering system transformed Talmudic study forever. Remember, the Talmud was thousands of pages long, multiple football fields worth of manuscripts without a consistent numbering system. So it was almost impossible to be on the same page as a different scholar, literally. Imagine trying to tell someone how to find an entry in a dictionary that isn't organized alphabetically and is also 10,000 pages long. That's what cross-referencing the Talmud was like before Bomberg created a page numbering system. Bomberg gave each page, or daf, in the Talmud a specific number, with either side of the page called an amud, referred to as side A or side B. So let's take a look. This is the first page of the first volume of the Babylonian Talmud, Brachot, or blessings. This standard layout drew on the Soncino layout, the Bomberg innovations, and was later finalized by a Jewish printing company in Lithuania. So what's going on here? This part here is Mishnah, the materials codified by Rabbi Yehudah HaNasi. Each volume, or tractate, of the Talmud opens with a line of the Mishnah. In this case, the Mishnah says, Meimatai korein et Shema ba'arvit. From what time does one recite the Shema prayer in the evening? We'll get deeper into that in a moment. Each line of the Mishnah is always then followed by the Gemara, which can go on for pages and pages and pages before another piece of Mishnah is quoted again. Deciphering the Gemara is an exercise in decoding layers on layers on layers, starting with its language. Now, surprise, the Gemara is written not in Hebrew, like the Mishnah, but in Aramaic, the daily Jewish language during the time of the Talmud, which needs its own dictionary. The Gemara has no punctuation at all. So what do? Well, for that, we asked Torah scholar Rabbi Yitz Jacobs.
So it uses words as punctuation. They're kind of like function words. This word means that I'm about to attack what previously came from a higher source, right? So there's all these function words. You have to learn this whole language of how the Gemara functions.
On top of decrypting all these function words, the Gemara is written in a very terse, truncated style. There's abbreviations and slang, and sometimes entire clauses missing. So you, the reader, have to figure out when a sentence begins and ends, and get a little creative to fill in the gaps in order to get the full meaning. Now, every page of Talmud includes a standard pair of commentaries. First, located on the inner margin of the page, is Rashi. Rashi was an 11th century French scholar, and his commentary is considered fundamental to understanding the Gemara. On the outer side are the Tosafists, 12th and 13th century scholars who lived mainly in France and Germany. Some of them were actually Rashi's sons-in-law and grandsons. The publishers of the Vilna edition also included other commentaries in the margins. These are a collection of scholars from across the centuries who also wrote commentaries demystifying the Talmud. Then, there are several places on the page that note cross-references to other lines in the Torah, medieval Jewish law, and other parts of the Talmud. Think of these as like Talmudic hyperlinks. And that's a standard Talmud page. It's dense, crowded, and there are even more commentaries not included on the printed page. Book after book after book of commentary on commentary on commentary. An endless ongoing conversation that's all rooted in a 1,500-year-old text. A conversation that starts with one of the most basic aspects of daily Jewish life, with the Shema prayer. Remember, I said we'd get back to this. The Shema is the foundational prayer in Judaism. It asserts the oneness and unity of God. Just 6 words long, it's recited 3 times a day, during morning prayers, evening prayers, and again, right before you go to bed. Now, the very first Mishnah asks the question, from when do we recite the Shema in the evening? All right, ready? We're gonna learn some Talmud together. Shema is said in the evening, so the Mishnah asks the obvious question, when does the evening actually start? The Mishnah then offers a brief explanation of about 100 words for when the evening starts and ends. Case closed. Simple, right? But not so fast. Then comes the Gemara, which spends over 8,500 words dissecting this seemingly simple question. First, the rabbis of the Gemara ask, why is the Mishnah talking about the evening? Let's talk about the morning. Okay, but actually, now back to the evening. Alright, so the evening is related to the time priests eat a designated produce in the temple, but wait, what about when a poor person starts his or her evening? Isn't that different than when the temple priests start their evening? Oh, and what even is evening? And on and on and on. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, the Gemara is suddenly in a discussion about not entering a ruined building in case there might be a demon there. So now it's your turn to ask the obvious question, what do demons have to do with the time that Shema is recited in the evening? Nothing? Everything? This radical deviation from the topic is quintessential Gemara. Just reading the Gemara straight through is like a cat chasing a laser. It's a constant whiplash of questions, answers, statements, disputed evidence, tangents that loop into other tangents that loop into a funny anecdote. So how do you read the Talmud? How does one even begin to read a text where tangents reign supreme, time collapses, centuries of voices overlap?
The way that we actually learn Talmud is what's called a Chavrusa learning model. Chavrusa means a learning partner. The two of you go, start reading through the text, explaining your interpretations, your understandings, and you fight it out. This encourages deep listening, shared discovery, productive disagreement, sharpening your thinking and debate skills.
As Rabbi Jacobs puts it, Talmud study isn't something you do in a vacuum. In fact, it's designed to create connection, intellectual connection between ideas, and emotional connection between people.
When you study it, you have to hold multiple opinions simultaneously about the same subject matter, as well as how these opinions would be applied if certain factors were changed, and this hypothetical, which creates this matrix of opinions and scenarios.
Okay, so the Talmud is a great form of mental exercise, but it takes years to study. And these days, there are a lot of books that summarize Jewish law in a straightforward style without the endless back and forth. Wouldn't it be easier to just memorize those than to study a multi-volume encyclopedia?
We can make a comparison to studying constitutional law versus studying case law. So constitutional law is where we derive the case law from, but everything in case law has to still be true, the constitutional law. And without the constitutional law, you will not really understand how the case law has developed. So when you understand the principles as thoroughly as possible, it opens up a whole world of application.
In this analogy, the Talmud is the Constitution, the baseline principles that the law must follow. It's a repository of hypotheticals layered onto other hypotheticals. And the rabbis of the Talmud often get in the weeds of highly improbable and sometimes controversial edge cases when they're exploring legal theories. Reading some of these discussions can make you do a double take, but the Talmud is stress testing the principles to see how far they extend. It's a logic puzzle, divorced from any emotional reality. It's like debate club on steroids. But why take everything to its extreme ends and turn hypotheticals inside and out and argue for pages and pages? Maybe because debate is the whole point.
What does it mean when you're at the point where you are debating a hair-splitting detail? It means that you agree on everything else. We're not debating on the religion. We're debating on minutia. And we care so much about that minutia because we believe it comes from God Almighty Himself that we spend this much time trying to rectify it and get it straight.
The Talmud is the embodiment of the Jewish tendency to quiz everything and pick things apart and tinker and ask a lot of questions, all for the sake of arriving at the truth. And sure, Jews as a people like to answer a question with another question, but that's not all that the Talmud reflects. It's the manifestation of Jews as agents of our own destiny. In an alternate history where the Romans never sacked the temple, would Rabbi Yehudah HaNasi have invoked the emergency clause to write the Mishnah, the oral law? Would the rabbis in Israel and Babylonia have recorded pages and pages and pages of debates and discussion? It's hard to say. The Jewish people were forced into circumstances out of their control, but instead of letting the circumstances own them, they seized the moment to ensure that the tradition wouldn't disappear. The true power of the Talmud is in its relationship to Jewish continuity, to Jewish identity, of what it tells us about the importance of dialogue and listening to the other. That's why Jews still study the Talmud after 1,500 years, page after page, across vast distances and oceans. It's why in 1923, a rabbi in Poland created a daily system where everyone studies the same double-sided page of the Talmud, open to any Jew, no matter what time zone they're in. It's like the greatest synchronized team sport in the world. One page of Talmud a day, 7.5 years to complete. It's why publishers have spent years meticulously translating every word to make the Talmud globally accessible. It's why if you walk into a Jewish study hall anywhere in the world today, chances are you'll find a chavrusa, two people going back and forth over the Gemara, the Mishnah, the Rashi, the Tosfot, asking each other ancient questions. When is one responsible for damages? When do you return an item that was lost? At what point of the evening do we recite the prayer that sanctifies God's oneness? Because the Talmud isn't an ancient book frozen in time. It's a living, breathing conversation happening right now.